In a small, tight-knit town, one boy's act of kindness would change everything. A young boy, faced with prejudice and suspicion, returns a lost wallet to its wealthy owner. But when the truth is revealed, the shocking twist will make you rethink everything you knew about kindness and redemption. Before we get into this unforgettable story, make sure you're subscribed to Epic Story Moments. Don't forget to hit that bell so you never miss another amazing tale. If you enjoy the story, like, share, and leave a comment. It helps us bring more heartwarming stories your way. And we'd love to know, where are you watching from? Let's stay connected. David, a kind-hearted 12-year-old black boy, lived in a small, close-knit English-speaking town where life was simple but not without its challenges. David's home was modest, and his mother, a hard-working single parent, juggled multiple jobs to keep their lives afloat. Despite their struggles, she instilled in him the values of honesty, kindness, and resilience, teaching him that character was more valuable than wealth. The neighborhood bustled with life. Children playing in the streets, vendors selling their wares, and neighbors exchanging pleasantries. David, known for his helpful nature, often lent a hand to those in need, whether it was carrying groceries for an elderly neighbor or helping younger kids with their schoolwork. Yet, beneath the friendly exterior of the town, subtle prejudices lingered. David, though respected by many, was occasionally met with wary looks or hesitant smiles. One afternoon after school, David decided to stop by the park to unwind. The autumn breeze rustled the leaves, and the golden hues of the setting sun bathed the area in a warm glow. As he sat on a bench, he noticed something unusual on the ground, a wallet. Curious, he picked it up and opened it. Inside was a substantial amount of cash and an ID card belonging to a man named Mr. Jacobs. The name seemed familiar. David recalled hearing it in passing, linked to a wealthy businessman who owned several properties in town. David's heart raced as he held the wallet. His initial excitement at finding something valuable was quickly replaced by a sense of responsibility. What should he do? Should he take it to the police? Should he return it himself? He decided to take it home first and seek his mother's advice, knowing she would guide him wisely. Unbeknownst to him, this simple discovery would set off a chain of events that would test his character and challenge the assumptions of those around him. As David walked home, the weight of the wallet in his backpack felt heavier than it should have. His mind swirled with questions. Should he take it to the police station and let them handle it? Should he try to find the owner himself? Every option seemed fraught with uncertainty. The wallet wasn't just full of money. It held a piece of someone's life. Credit cards, membership IDs, and personal items. Losing such a thing would surely be distressing for anyone. When he got home, his mother was in the kitchen, preparing a simple dinner after a long day at work. David hesitated before pulling the wallet from his bag and placing it on the table. She turned, her brow furrowing as she took it in. "Where did you find this?" she asked, her tone both curious and cautious. "At the park," David explained, recounting the moment he saw it lying near the bench. "It belongs to someone named Mr. Jacobs." "I don't know what to do." His mother examined the wallet, flipping through its contents. "It's a lot of money," she said softly, her voice tinged with concern. "You did the right thing by bringing it here, but returning this won't be simple. People might not see your intentions the way they should." David frowned. "What do you mean?" His mother sighed and sat down, placing a hand on his shoulder. "Sometimes, people don't trust others who look like us, especially when money is involved. You might have to prove you didn't take anything, even though I know you'd never do that." David's heart sank at her words. He had always known about the unspoken judgments that existed in their town, but hearing his mother voice them so plainly stung. Still, he nodded. "I want to return it. It's the right thing to do." "Then be careful," his mother said firmly. "Take it back yourself, but don't go alone. Let them know you found it and that you mean no harm." Meanwhile, across town, Mr. Jacobs was pacing in his spacious, meticulously kept home. He had only realized his wallet was missing an hour ago, and panic had quickly set in. He called his office to see if he had left it there, but no one could find it. "It's gone," he muttered to himself, his frustration boiling over. Someone must have picked it up. A thief, no doubt. Mr. Jacobs wasn't a man accustomed to losing control, and the thought of someone taking his wallet infuriated him. It wasn't just the money, though there was quite a bit of it. It was the principle. His mind conjured images of shady figures rifling through his belongings, and without concrete evidence, suspicion began to fester. Determined to recover his wallet, he made a few calls, spreading the word among his business associates and employees. "If anyone hears anything about a missing wallet, let me know immediately," he instructed. Though he hadn't accused anyone outright, his tone carried an edge that made it clear he suspected foul play. Back at home, David prepared himself for what lay ahead. The wallet was intact, but his mother's warning echoed in his mind. He knew returning it wouldn't be as simple as walking up to Mr. Jacobs and handing it over. Still, he was resolute. Tomorrow, he would go to the address listed on the ID card. As he lay in bed that night, he couldn't shake the uneasy feeling that this small act of honesty might turn into something far more complicated than he could have anticipated. The next morning, David stood outside the towering glass office building where Mr. Jacobs worked. The structure loomed over him, gleaming in the sunlight, a stark contrast to the modest surroundings he was used to. Clutching the wallet tightly in his hand, he took a deep breath, steeling himself for what he hoped would be a simple act of returning it to its rightful owner. As he entered the lobby, the pristine marble floors and sleek decor immediately made him feel out of place. A receptionist sitting behind a large desk glanced up as he approached. Her friendly demeanor shifted to one of guarded suspicion when she noticed a worn backpack slung over his shoulder and his slightly hesitant gait. "Can I help you?" she asked, her tone clipped. David nodded, holding up the wallet. "I found this yesterday. It belongs to Mr. Jacobs. I'm here to return it." The receptionist's eyes flicked to the wallet and then back to David. She frowned. "Do you have an appointment?" "No," David admitted, "but it's important. I just need to give this to him." She hesitated, her expression skeptical. "Wait here," she said, picking up the phone. After a brief, murmured conversation, she hung up and gestured toward a security guard standing nearby. "He'll escort you." David followed the guard, his nerves growing with each step. They entered an elevator that whisked them up to the top floor, where the guard led him to a large office with a heavy wooden door. Inside, Mr. Jacobs stood by a window, his back to the room. When he turned and saw David, his expression immediately darkened. "You found my wallet," Mr. Jacobs said, his tone cold. "Yes, sir," David replied, stepping forward to hand it over. But Mr. Jacobs didn't take it. Instead, he crossed his arms and narrowed his eyes. "And where exactly did you find it?" "At the park," David explained, "near the bench by the fountain. I wanted to return it right away, but—" "Near the bench," Mr. Jacobs interrupted, his voice dripping with disbelief. "How convenient. And what were you doing at the park?" "I go there after school sometimes," David answered, his grip tightening on the wallet. "I promise, I didn't take anything. It's all there." Mr. Jacobs took a step closer, his piercing gaze fixed on David. "How do I know that?" "For all I know, you could have taken it and decided to bring back what was left after feeling guilty." David's stomach dropped. He opened the wallet and held it out. "You can check. Everything's in there." But Mr. Jacobs didn't reach for it. Instead, he turned to the security guard. "Call the police," he said firmly. "Let them handle this." David's heart pounded. "Please wait. I'm telling the truth," he pleaded. "I just wanted to do the right thing." The security guard hesitated, glancing between Mr. Jacobs and David. "Maybe we should just check the wallet first, sir," he suggested cautiously. Mr. Jacobs ignored him, his focus still on David. "If you're so honest, why didn't you take it straight to the police?" "Why bring it here?" he demanded. David's voice shook as he answered. "Because I thought you'd want it back yourself. I didn't think anyone would believe me if I handed it in. That's why I wrote this." He pulled out the note he'd tucked into the wallet, explaining who he was and why he was returning it. Mr. Jacobs snatched the note and read it, his expression unreadable. But instead of softening, his suspicion seemed to harden. Anyone can write a note like this. It doesn't prove anything. The room felt stifling as silence stretched between them. The security guard shifted uncomfortably, and David's hands trembled as he clutched the wallet. Finally, he took a deep breath and looked directly at Mr. Jacobs. "I don't know how to make you believe me," he said quietly, "but I swear I only wanted to help." The sincerity in his voice hung in the air, but Mr. Jacobs remained unmoved. "We'll see what the police have to say about that," he said. David's shoulders slumped, but he didn't run. Instead, he stood his ground, his resolve unwavering despite the doubt and hostility surrounding him. The sound of the security guard speaking into his radio filled the room, heightening the tension. As the scene closed, the viewer was left wondering, how could David prove his innocence when trust was already stacked against him? David stood frozen as the security guard finished the call. The weight of Mr. Jacobs' accusations pressed down on him like a heavy blanket, making it hard to breathe. He could feel the receptionist and guard's eyes on him, their silent judgment cutting deeper than words. "Please," David tried again, his voice trembling but firm. "I'm not lying. I just wanted to return the wallet." Mr. Jacobs crossed his arms, unmoved. "If you're telling the truth, you'll have nothing to worry about when the police arrive." David looked down at the wallet in his hands, his reflection in its polished leather blurred by the tears welling in his eyes. His mother's warning echoed in his mind. "Sometimes, people won't trust you no matter how good your intentions are," but no warning could have prepared him for the humiliation of being treated like a criminal for doing the right thing. Moments later, 2 police officers walked into the office. Their crisp uniforms and no-nonsense demeanor only heightened David's anxiety. One of them, a stern-faced woman in her 40s, approached Mr. Jacobs first. "You called about a missing wallet." "Yes," Mr. Jacobs said, gesturing toward David. "He claims he found it, but I'm not convinced. The wallet was missing since yesterday, and he didn't come forward until today. It doesn't add up." The officer turned her attention to David, her expression neutral but her gaze sharp. "What's your name, son?" "David," he replied quietly. "And where did you find the wallet?" "At the park," David said, swallowing hard. "It was lying near the bench by the fountain. I brought it home and told my mom. She told me to bring it here today." The officer nodded, jotting down notes. "Why didn't you take it to the police station right away?" David hesitated, his fingers tightening around the wallet. "I didn't think anyone would believe me," he admitted, his voice barely above a whisper. "I thought if I returned it myself, it would be better." The officer raised an eyebrow. "Why would you think no one would believe you?" David struggled to find the words, his cheeks flushing with shame and frustration. Before he could answer, Mr. Jacobs interjected, "Because he knows how suspicious this looks. Who finds a wallet full of cash and sits on it for a day? It doesn't make sense." The officer held up a hand, silencing Mr. Jacobs. "Let me handle this," she said firmly before turning back to David. "Do you still have everything that was in the wallet when you found it?" "Yes," David said quickly, handing it over. "You can check." The officer took the wallet and began examining its contents. As she worked, David's mind drifted to memories of his childhood, his mother's voice guiding him through life's challenges. He remembered her saying, "David, no matter what the world throws at you, always be honest. People may doubt you, but your character will shine through in the end." She had always led by example, working tirelessly to provide for him while still finding time to volunteer at their church and help neighbors in need. David had absorbed her values like a sponge, learning that kindness and integrity were not just words, but actions that defined a person. In one vivid memory, he was 8 years old, and they had been walking home from the store when they found a stray dog limping on the side of the road. Despite their limited means, his mother insisted they take it to the vet and nurse it back to health. Every life matters, she had said. We do what's right, even when it's hard. Now, standing in Mr. Jacobs' office, David clung to those lessons, even as doubt and fear threatened to overwhelm him. He had done what was right, but instead of being met with gratitude, he faced suspicion and hostility. The officer finished inspecting the wallet and looked up. Everything seems to be here, she said, her tone measured. She turned to Mr. Jacobs. Do you notice anything missing? Mr. Jacobs hesitated, his brow furrowing as he flipped through the wallet. No, he admitted grudgingly. But that doesn't mean he didn't take anything and put it back. The officer sighed, clearly unimpressed with Mr. Jacobs' insinuation. She turned back to David. Son, do you have anything else to add? David met her gaze, his voice steady despite the lump in his throat. I just wanted to return it. That's all. The officer's face softened for a moment, but the tension in the room remained thick. As she continued her line of questioning, David couldn't help but wonder if the truth would ever be enough to break through the walls of doubt surrounding him. The scene closed with the officers exchanging a glance, leaving viewers uncertain about whether justice or prejudice would prevail. As the tension in Mr. Jacobs' office simmered, the sound of a floor buffer echoed faintly down the hallway. The building's janitor, Mrs. Harper, approached the scene, her mop bucket rolling along behind her. A warm, middle-aged woman with kind eyes and a sharp wit, Mrs. Harper had worked in the building for years. She had seen countless faces pass through its doors, and she prided herself on knowing when someone was being genuine. Peering into the office, she took in the sight. David, standing small and resolute, clutching his backpack. Mr. Jacobs, towering with an air of distrust. And the police officers, caught between skepticism and professionalism. Mrs. Harper's gaze softened as it landed on David. She had seen him enter earlier, hesitating by the front desk before being ushered upstairs. "Excuse me," she said, stepping inside. Her voice was calm but firm, cutting through the tense atmosphere. I don't mean to interrupt, but I saw this young man when he came in. He didn't look like someone up to no good. If anything, he seemed nervous, like he wasn't sure he'd even be let in. Mr. Jacobs turned to her, his expression skeptical. "And who are you?" "Harper. I'm the janitor here," she replied, unbothered by his dismissive tone. "I'm just saying what I saw. This boy didn't sneak in or act suspicious. He walked straight to the desk and said he wanted to return something." The police officers exchanged glances, but Mr. Jacobs scoffed. "With all due respect, Mrs. Harper, how does that prove he didn't take the wallet in the first place?" Mrs. Harper raised an eyebrow, unimpressed with his dismissive attitude. "It doesn't," she admitted, "but maybe it's worth considering that he's telling the truth instead of jumping to conclusions." Meanwhile, outside the office, another figure had been listening intently. Emily Jacobs, Mr. Jacobs' estranged daughter, stood just out of view, her curiosity piqued by the raised voices and the mention of her father's name. Emily was in her mid-20s, with a quiet demeanor that masked a sharp mind. She had returned to town only recently after years of studying and working abroad, hoping to mend the strained relationship with her father. She stepped into the room, her presence catching everyone off guard. "What's going on here?" she asked, her tone calm but laced with authority. Mr. Jacobs turned, his surprise quickly replaced by a hint of irritation. "Emily, this isn't the time." Emily ignored his dismissal, her eyes landing on David. She could see the fear and exhaustion etched on his face, and something about his expression struck a chord with her. She remembered the times in her own life when she had faced judgment based on assumptions rather than facts. Experiences she rarely spoke of but had shaped her deeply. "This young man is being questioned for trying to return my wallet," Mr. Jacobs explained tersely, his voice dripping with frustration. "He claims he found it, but the story doesn't add up." Emily frowned. "Doesn't add up? Or it doesn't fit your assumptions?" Her words hung in the air, sharp and deliberate. Mr. Jacobs stiffened. "Emily, this isn't your concern." "Maybe it should be," she countered, stepping closer. She turned to David, her voice softening. "What's your name?" "David," he said quietly, his voice barely above a whisper. Emily smiled gently. "David, thank you for bringing the wallet back. It takes courage to do the right thing, especially when people doubt you." Her words seemed to catch everyone off guard, even the officers. David looked at her, surprised by the unexpected kindness. "Emily," Mr. Jacobs said, his tone warning, "you don't know the whole story." "And maybe neither do you," she replied, her gaze steady. Turning back to David, she asked, "What made you decide to bring it here instead of the police?" David hesitated before answering. I thought it would mean more if I gave it back in person. I didn't want anyone to think I'd taken something." Emily nodded, her expression thoughtful. "That makes sense." She looked at her father. "Doesn't it?" Mr. Jacobs didn't respond, his jaw tightening as he avoided her gaze. Mrs. Harper, still watching from the corner, gave a small nod of approval, as if to say, finally, someone's listening. As Emily continued to observe David, she saw no signs of deceit, only a boy trying to do the right thing in an impossible situation. A flicker of determination sparked within her. She wasn't sure how, but she was going to help him prove it. For now, though, the tension remained, and the room's charged atmosphere left the outcome uncertain. The tension in the room grew unbearable as everyone waited for the next move. The police officer, Mrs. Harper, and Emily all seemed to shift their focus to Mr. Jacobs, who continued to scrutinize David with skepticism. David stood his ground, his young face a mixture of fear and quiet determination. As Mr. Jacobs flipped through the wallet one last time, something caught his eye. Tucked inside the back pocket was a small, folded piece of paper. Frowning, he pulled it out and unfolded it. The room fell silent as he read the handwritten note. The note read, "Asterisk to the owner of this wallet. I found this at the park and wanted to make sure it got back to you. My mom taught me that doing the right thing isn't always easy, but it's always worth it. I hope this helps you as much as it's helping me show her I listened to her lessons. David Asterisk." The weight of the words seemed to hang in the air. For a moment, Mr. Jacobs said nothing, his expression unreadable. Emily, noticing the note, leaned forward. "What's that?" she asked, her voice cutting through the silence. "It's a note," Mr. Jacobs muttered, his voice uncharacteristically subdued. Emily stepped closer and took the paper from him, reading it aloud. As she spoke, the sincerity of David's words filled the room. Mrs. Harper smiled knowingly, and even the police officers exchanged softened glances. But Mr. Jacobs remained stoic, his jaw tightening. "David," Emily said gently, turning to him, "you wrote this?" He nodded, his hands nervously fidgeting at his sides. "Yes, ma'am. I didn't want anyone to think I'd done something wrong. I thought if I left a note, maybe it would help." Emily's heart ached for the boy. She could see the earnestness in his eyes, the fear of not being believed despite his good intentions. She turned to her father, her tone firm. "Dad, you can't seriously still think he's lying after this." But instead of responding, Mr. Jacobs let out a deep sigh and finally spoke, his words unexpected. "This wallet, I left it at the park on purpose." The room froze. Everyone, including the police officers, turned to him in surprise. "What?" Emily asked, her voice sharp with disbelief. "I wanted to see if anyone would return it," Mr. Jacobs admitted, his tone defensive. "I've seen too many people take advantage of situations like this. I thought it would be a good way to test people's honesty." David's jaw dropped, and his hands clenched at his sides. "You left it there on purpose?" he asked, his voice filled with a mix of hurt and confusion. Mr. Jacobs nodded, avoiding David's gaze. "Yes, but what I didn't expect was for someone like you to..." He stopped himself, realizing too late the weight of his words. "Someone like him?" Emily interjected, her voice rising in anger. "What exactly do you mean by that?" Mr. Jacobs hesitated, his face flushing. "I didn't mean it that way," he said quickly. I didn't think..." No, you didn't think, Emily snapped. You judged him before you even knew anything about him. He returned your wallet, wrote you a heartfelt note, and stood here trying to defend himself, and you still couldn't see his honesty. Mrs. Harper crossed her arms, nodding in agreement. She's right. This boy's been nothing but polite and honest since he walked through those doors. Maybe it's time you admit you were wrong. Mr. Jacobs looked down at the wallet in his hands, the weight of the situation finally sinking in. He had set out to test humanity's honesty, but had let his own biases blind him to the truth staring him in the face. David had passed the test with flying colors, yet he had failed to recognize it. I'm sorry, Mr. Jacobs said at last, his voice barely audible. He looked at David, his expression conflicted. You didn't deserve this. David swallowed hard, the sting of the experience still fresh. I didn't return the wallet to prove anything, he said quietly. I just thought it was the right thing to do. The rawness of his words struck everyone in the room, leaving a heavy silence in their wake. Emily placed a hand on David's shoulder, her expression one of quiet support. You did more than the right thing, David. You showed more integrity than most adults would. As the scene ended, Mr. Jacobs looked at the note in his hand, the weight of his actions finally catching up to him. But the damage had been done, and the question lingered. Could he truly make amends for the harm caused by his assumptions? David took a deep breath, his young voice trembling but steady as he finally broke his silence. I don't know why you think I'm lying, he said, his gaze locked on Mr. Jacobs. But I didn't take your wallet. I found it at the park, right by the bench near the playground. At first, I thought about leaving it there, but then I thought about what my mom would say. She always tells me to do the right thing, even when it's hard. So I brought it here because I thought you might need it. His words were simple, but the raw honesty in his tone silenced the room. Even the skeptical police officers softened, exchanging glances that hinted at a change in their perception. Emily, standing beside David, nodded encouragingly, her quiet support helping him continue. I knew some people might not believe me, David went on, his voice faltering slightly, but I thought it didn't matter as long as I did what was right. I didn't expect it to be this hard, though. His admission cut through the tension like a knife. Mrs. Harper, still standing near the door, cleared her throat. You know, she said, drawing the room's attention, there's a security camera outside the front entrance. It's been working just fine since last week. Her words seemed to electrify the atmosphere. Everyone turned to her, expressions shifting from confusion to realization. You mean there's footage of him coming in? One of the officers asked. Mrs. Harper nodded. Sure is. It should show exactly how he walked in and what he was carrying. For the first time, Mr. Jacobs seemed genuinely unsettled. His eyes darted between David and the janitor, his confidence shaken. Well, he said gruffly, maybe we should take a look. The group moved to the building's security room, where Mrs. Harper expertly navigated the grainy footage. Within moments, the screen displayed David entering the building, holding the wallet carefully in his hands. The timestamp aligned perfectly with the time David claimed to have found the wallet. There you have it, Mrs. Harper said, her tone triumphant. No sneaking, no stealing. Just a kid doing what he said he did. The room fell silent as the evidence sank in. Mr. Jacobs stared at the screen, his expression shifting from doubt to guilt. The weight of his assumptions hung heavy in the air, and for the first time, he looked at David not as a potential thief, but as a child who had shown more courage and honesty than most adults. I don't know what to say, Mr. Jacobs muttered, his voice low and strained. I'm sorry, David. I misjudged you. I let my own biases cloud my judgment. David nodded, his face calm but resolute. I didn't do it for an apology, he said. I just wanted to do the right thing. Emily stepped forward, her voice firm but kind. Dad, maybe it's time you start rethinking how you look at people. Not everyone is out to get you. Some people just want to help. Mr. Jacobs didn't respond immediately, his gaze fixed on the screen as the video replayed David's entrance. The guilt was evident in his eyes, But so was something else. A flicker of respect for the boy who had stood firm despite everything. As they returned to the office, the mood had shifted. The air was still tense, but the dynamic had changed. Mr. Jacobs, for all his faults, was beginning to understand the depth of his mistake. Meanwhile, David, though hurt by the ordeal, held his head high, his integrity shining brighter than ever. The turning point had arrived, and it was clear that nothing would be the same for any of them. David sat there in the dimly lit office, his posture calm and composed, despite the whirlwind of emotions he must have felt. His gaze never wavered from Mr. Jacobs, who seemed to be struggling with the weight of his actions. "I'm not angry," David said quietly, breaking the silence. "I'm just disappointed." He paused, his words soft but piercing. "I thought doing the right thing would make things better. But sometimes people don't see it that way." Mr. Jacobs opened his mouth to speak, but the words caught in his throat. He had expected anger, resentment, even accusation from the boy he had wronged. Instead, David was offering him something far harder to handle. Understanding. David continued, his voice gaining strength as he spoke. "I understand that it's hard to trust people, but honesty and kindness, they matter, even when no one believes in them. I didn't bring the wallet to get something back or to prove a point. I just thought it was the right thing to do. And sometimes, that's all we can do, even if it means being misunderstood." His words seemed to hang in the air, settling in the room like a weight. Emily, who had been quietly observing, stepped forward, her gaze sharp but filled with empathy. She turned to her father, her tone both challenging and compassionate. "Dad, do you see it now? David didn't do this for any reward, for any recognition. He did it because it was the right thing to do. And you nearly ruined that. You didn't see him as someone trying to do good. You saw him as a problem, someone to be suspected. And that's where your bias blinded you." Mr. Jacobs flinched as if her words had struck him physically. He opened his mouth as if to defend himself, but Emily cut him off gently. "I know you've been through a lot, Dad, but that doesn't excuse seeing people through a lens of suspicion, just because they look different or come from a different place. You've always been quick to protect yourself from others. But maybe it's time you start seeing the good in people." Mr. Jacobs looked at his daughter, and for the first time, there was no irritation in his eyes, just exhaustion. He closed his eyes briefly, a deep sigh escaping his lips as the weight of his own actions began to settle on him. I've spent so many years closing myself off," he muttered, his voice quiet and vulnerable. "I thought I was protecting myself, protecting what I built, but maybe I was just afraid. Afraid to trust, afraid to believe in anyone." He turned to David, who sat patiently, his eyes filled with quiet resolve. "I should have trusted you," Mr. Jacobs said, his voice cracking slightly. I'm sorry, David. I let my fears get in the way of seeing you for who you are. A boy with integrity, not someone out to deceive." David met his gaze, his face softening. "It's okay," he replied quietly. "You didn't know, but now you do." The vulnerability in Mr. Jacobs' voice seemed to break something inside him. He sat back in his chair, his hands trembling slightly as he folded them in his lap. "I've spent my life building walls," he said, his voice low but filled with regret. "I thought if I kept everyone out, I'd be safe. But now I realize all I've done is shut myself off from the very thing that could have made everything better. I never gave anyone a chance. And because of that, I almost missed a chance to see someone like you, David." David nodded slowly, his expression one of quiet understanding. "Sometimes it's hard to trust, but you can start by trusting one person, and then another. It's not easy, but it's worth it." Emily, seeing her father's breakdown, placed a hand on his shoulder. "It's not too late, Dad," she said softly. "You can still change. You can still start seeing people for who they are, not what you assume them to be." The room fell into a reflective silence as Mr. Jacobs absorbed his daughter's words, his eyes welling up with tears. He had spent so much of his life protecting himself from the world, only to realize that the walls he built had kept him from seeing the truth. The truth that people, regardless of their background or appearance, could be kind, honest, and trustworthy. "Thank you, David," Mr. Jacobs said, his voice thick with emotion. "Thank you for teaching me what I should have known all along." David nodded, his expression softening. "I didn't do it for you, Mr. Jacobs. I did it because it was the right thing." And in that moment, Mr. Jacobs felt something shift inside him. It was the beginning of understanding, the beginning of change. For the first time in a long while, he didn't feel the need to protect himself. Instead, he felt the weight of his past decisions and the opportunity to do better moving forward. The room was heavy with the weight of the conversation. After a long pause, Mr. Jacobs cleared his throat and sat up straighter in his chair, his gaze still fixed on David. "I've been thinking," he said, his voice now soft but filled with sincerity. "I know I've wronged you, and I've realized I want to do something to make it right." David looked up, his expression still composed but tinged with caution. "What do you mean?" Mr. Jacobs hesitated, clearly wrestling with how to express himself. Finally, he spoke. "I want to reward you, David, for your honesty, for doing the right thing when no one expected it. You didn't have to return that wallet, but you did. I owe you something, a gift, a reward, whatever you'd like." David blinked in surprise. He had expected an apology, perhaps even an acknowledgement, but not this. The idea of receiving something in return for doing what he believed was the right thing felt strange to him. He shifted uncomfortably in his seat. "I don't want anything, Mr. Jacobs," David said firmly. "I didn't return your wallet for a reward. I did it because it was the right thing to do. Sometimes you just do things because they're the right thing, not because you're going to get something out of it." Mr. Jacobs looked at him, clearly moved by the boy's maturity. He hadn't expected such a response, but it made him feel even more guilty for misjudging David in the first place. His gaze softened as he took a breath. "I understand," Mr. Jacobs said, his voice quieter now, filled with a mixture of respect and regret. "I should have seen that sooner. I've spent so much of my life trying to find ways to protect myself that I forgot what it means to do the right thing without expecting anything in return. You've reminded me of something important, David." Emily, who had been silently watching the exchange, spoke up. "Dad, maybe it's time we both start changing how we see the world. You've always believed that people take advantage of others, but sometimes people are just good, no strings attached. Maybe we should both learn to trust people more, to give them the benefit of the doubt." Mr. Jacobs looked at her, his eyes filled with uncertainty, but also a flicker of understanding. "I don't know if I can change overnight," he admitted, his voice low, "but I'm willing to try. I've let my own fears and biases keep me from seeing the truth. It's just hard sometimes, you know." Emily nodded, her expression softening. "I know, Dad, but sometimes the hardest thing is letting go of the things that hold you back. We can start by trusting people like David, who don't have anything to prove. They just do what's right." Mr. Jacobs ran a hand over his face, the weight of the conversation settling in his mind. "You're right," he said quietly. "I've let my own past define the way I see the world, and it's not fair to you, to Emily, or to anyone else. I've been blind, and I didn't even realize it." David, still sitting across from them, watched the conversation unfold. He could see the sincerity in Mr. Jacobs' eyes, and while he didn't know if things would ever be perfect, he could tell that this was the beginning of something important. Change, it seemed, was starting to happen. "You don't have to do anything for me, Mr. Jacobs," David said again, his voice calm. "I just want you to know that I didn't do it for a reward or recognition. I did it because that's what you're supposed to do when you find something that belongs to someone else." There was a long pause, and then Mr. Jacobs, his voice full of emotion, spoke again. "You're right, David, and I want to thank you. I've learned more from you in the past few hours than I have in years of doing business and protecting myself from the world. I want to make it up to you. Please, let me invite you to dinner. It's the least I can do. I know it doesn't change what happened, but I want to show you that I truly respect what you've done." David's eyes widened, surprised at the gesture. He thought for a moment, glancing over at Emily, who gave him a warm, encouraging smile. Finally, David nodded. "Okay," he said, his voice soft but sincere. "I'd like that." Mr. Jacobs stood up, a small smile breaking through his usually stern demeanor. "It's settled then. We'll go out for dinner. It's the least I can do to make amends." As they all stood, ready to leave the office, there was a sense of resolution in the air. The tension had lifted, replaced by something more hopeful. Mr. Jacobs had begun to understand the importance of kindness and trust, and David had shown him what it meant to do the right thing, without expecting anything in return. As they walked out of the building together, the sound of their footsteps echoed in the hallway, but this time it felt different, lighter, like the beginning of a new chapter for all of them. A chapter where people might just start seeing each other for who they really were, rather than the assumptions that had once clouded their judgment. And in that moment, David knew that even though things wouldn't always be easy, he had made a difference, not just for himself, but for Mr. Jacobs, for Emily, and maybe even for the world. The atmosphere in the restaurant was warm and inviting, the flickering candlelight casting a soft glow on the faces of the three seated at the table. David, Mr. Jacobs, and Emily had ordered their meals, but the real conversation had yet to begin. The weight of the past few hours hung in the air, but there was a sense of calm now, a sense of resolution. As they sat across from each other, Mr. Jacobs shifted uncomfortably in his seat. He had been quiet for most of the meal, his mind racing with a mix of guilt, reflection, and a growing sense of gratitude toward the young boy who had taught him more than he ever anticipated. Now, as the conversation seemed to lull, he looked at David, his face solemn yet sincere. "I've been thinking a lot, David," Mr. Jacobs said, his voice uncharacteristically soft. "I know I can't undo what happened earlier, but I want to make it right in some way. I owe you an apology, and more than that, I owe your family an apology. I misjudged you, and I treated you unfairly. I was wrong." David looked at him, his eyes calm but filled with understanding. He had already forgiven Mr. Jacobs in his heart, and while the apology was important, it wasn't what mattered most. The dinner itself felt like a gesture of goodwill, one that David knew was more meaningful than any material reward. Mr. Jacobs continued, his voice steady but filled with remorse. "I want to offer your family a financial reward, David. It's the least I can do for what you've done. You didn't just return a wallet. You restored my faith in people. And for that, you and your mother deserve something more. You deserve recognition for your honesty, your integrity, and your kindness." David's mother, who had been quietly observing the conversation, smiled softly. She had worked hard to teach David the importance of dignity, and she could see that this gesture, while generous, might not align with their values. She placed a gentle hand on David's shoulder before speaking. "We appreciate your offer, Mr. Jacobs," she said, her voice calm yet firm. "But we don't need financial rewards. What David did, what we've all been through, is about something deeper. It's about doing what's right, regardless of the consequences. We value our dignity and believe that kindness and integrity should be its own reward." Mr. Jacobs blinked, his initial surprise at their refusal quickly replaced with a mixture of respect and admiration. He had expected gratitude for his offer, but what he hadn't expected was this quiet strength. The humility of David's family left him speechless for a moment, and he took a deep breath, realizing that perhaps the lesson he had learned from David went beyond just his own actions. It was about understanding the true value of dignity, respect, and doing what was right for the sake of it. "I understand," Mr. Jacobs finally said, his voice thick with emotion. "You're right. I shouldn't have assumed that money could fix things. You've shown me that there's more to life than wealth or status. What I should have been offering all along is my respect and my commitment to doing better." David's mother smiled, grateful for his understanding, but she couldn't help but feel that there was more to the conversation. "That's kind of you, Mr. Jacobs," she said, "but if you really want to make a difference, we've been thinking." Maybe instead of a personal reward, there's a way you can contribute to something that will help others, something that will carry the spirit of what David did. Mr. Jacobs looked at her with curiosity. What do you mean? David's mother continued, her voice thoughtful. You've got the resources and influence to make a real change. Maybe, instead of just rewarding David, you could fund a community program, a youth initiative that encourages honesty, kindness, and integrity, values that David embodies, something that could help kids in the neighborhood, give them opportunities to grow, and teach them the importance of doing the right thing. David's heart swelled as he listened to his mother's words. This wasn't about money. It was about something lasting, something that could continue to inspire others long after the dinner had ended. Mr. Jacobs paused, his face a mixture of surprise and contemplation. A program like that would be a legacy, wouldn't it? Yes, David's mother replied, a legacy of kindness, where young people are encouraged to choose integrity over the easy way out. Something that could help children who might not have had the same opportunities you and I had. A way to give back. Mr. Jacobs leaned back in his chair, his mind turning over the idea. It felt right. Far more meaningful than any financial reward. This was a chance to make a true difference, not just for David, but for countless others who needed the guidance that David's actions had already exemplified. I think that's a wonderful idea, Mr. Jacobs said slowly, his voice filled with genuine conviction. I'll fund a youth program in your name, David. I want to make sure that your integrity, your example, lives on. I want to help build something that honors the values you've shown me. David smiled, the weight of the evening's events settling in his heart. That sounds perfect, he said quietly. Thank you. As the evening wore on, the conversation shifted to lighter topics, but the emotional undercurrent of the night remained. The conflict that had once seemed insurmountable had found its resolution, and in its place stood a new understanding, one that transcended prejudice and misjudgment. By the time the meal had ended, David and his family had found not just an ally in Mr. Jacobs, but a partner in their shared vision for a better, more compassionate world. And for Mr. Jacobs, the dinner had been more than a gesture of atonement. It had been the beginning of a journey toward redemption, toward seeing people not for what they appeared to be, but for who they truly were. As they left the restaurant, the promise of the new youth program hung in the air, signaling a new chapter for all of them, a chapter where kindness, honesty, and the willingness to give people a chance would guide their paths forward. As the night wound down and David and his family made their way home, the streets of the small town seemed quieter than before, yet there was a subtle shift in the air. The story of the young boy who had returned the wallet, despite facing suspicion and prejudice, had begun to ripple through the community. The events of the past few days had left an indelible mark on everyone involved, and the lessons they had learned would stay with them for a long time to come. Mr. Jacobs sat in his office late into the night, the city lights casting long shadows across his desk. His thoughts wandered back to David, the young boy whose honesty and integrity had forced him to confront his own biases. As the hours passed, he realized that the experience had changed him in ways he had never expected. He had spent so much of his life focused on wealth, status, and control, believing that these were the things that defined a person. But David had shown him that the true measure of a person was their character, their capacity for kindness, honesty, and forgiveness. The weight of his earlier assumptions about David had lifted, replaced by a deep sense of regret and understanding. He had spent years judging others based on superficial qualities, but now he realized true justice wasn't about power or money. It was about seeing people for who they truly were. It was about giving them a chance to prove their worth through their actions, not their appearance or background. David's resilience in the face of prejudice had broken down the barriers Mr. Jacobs had erected over the years, and in doing so, had given him a chance to reevaluate everything he had believed. It was a humbling experience, one that made him realize that redemption wasn't just about making up for past mistakes. It was about recognizing the humanity in others and seeking forgiveness, both from them and from oneself. For David, the experience had been just as transformative. Though he had never expected a reward for doing the right thing, the kindness and understanding he had received from Mr. Jacobs and his family had shown him that even in the face of adversity, doing the right thing was worth it. He had been tested not just by the circumstances, but by the people who doubted him, and yet he had remained true to his values. His actions had inspired those around him, and through his quiet strength and integrity, he had helped others see the importance of trust and forgiveness. As word of David's actions spread throughout the town, people began to take notice. The local community, which had once been quick to judge and assume the worst, began to rethink their own biases. They saw in David not just a boy who had returned a lost wallet, but a young person who embodied the values of justice, integrity, and resilience. His courage had ignited a shift in the way people viewed one another, no longer through the lens of prejudice or suspicion, but through the understanding that everyone deserved a chance to prove their worth. In the weeks that followed, the youth program funded by Mr. Jacobs in David's name began to take shape. It was designed to teach young people the importance of honesty, kindness, and overcoming prejudice, values that David had so clearly demonstrated. The program became a safe space for children from all backgrounds to learn, grow, and engage with one another, and it quickly became a cornerstone of the community. David's actions had inspired not just a single person, but an entire town. The lessons of justice, redemption, and overcoming prejudice had resonated deeply with everyone who had heard his story. What had started as a simple act of kindness had blossomed into a movement, a reminder that no matter our differences, we all have the ability to do what is right and make the world a better place. In the end, the moral of David's story was clear. Kindness and integrity could break down even the deepest walls of prejudice. By choosing to do the right thing, David had shown that justice wasn't about punishing wrongdoing, but about offering understanding and forgiveness. Redemption wasn't something that could be earned through power or wealth, but through the genuine desire to change and grow. And most importantly, his story had reminded everyone that the real strength of a community came from the willingness to see each other as human beings, deserving of kindness, respect, and trust. As David lay in bed that night, the weight of the day finally settling over him, he felt a quiet sense of peace. He hadn't just done something good. He had changed the world one small act of kindness at a time, and that he knew was something worth more than any reward could ever offer. In the weeks that followed, David became a local hero. His name was no longer just that of a quiet, humble boy from the neighborhood. It became synonymous with integrity, honesty, and courage. The story of his actions spread far and wide, with local news outlets covering the events and highlighting the positive impact he had made. People from all walks of life came to know David's name, and many were inspired by his simple yet profound decision to return the wallet without hesitation, despite the prejudice and suspicion he faced. Children in the town looked up to him, seeing him not just as a boy, but as a living example of doing the right thing, even when it was hard. Teachers used his story to encourage their students to act with kindness and integrity, teaching them that true strength wasn't in wealth or power, but in moral character and doing the right thing for the sake of others. Even those who had once doubted David began to see him in a new light, admiring his unwavering honesty. Mr. Jacobs, too, experienced a profound change. Once a man driven by wealth and status, he had found a new purpose in his life through the lessons learned from David. Working alongside Emily, who had grown to admire David's courage, Mr. Jacobs took a more active role in community initiatives. Together, they worked to promote programs aimed at breaking down prejudices, fostering understanding, and giving young people the opportunities they deserved. The youth program that Mr. Jacobs had funded in David's name was now thriving, bringing together children from all backgrounds, teaching them values of kindness, respect, and justice. As Mr. Jacobs and Emily sat in his office, planning the next phase of their community outreach, they shared a moment of understanding. Emily had learned, through her own journey, the importance of seeing others beyond their surface. Her father's transformation was proof that people could change, that redemption was possible. Working together, father and daughter forged a new bond, a bond built on empathy, growth, and the desire to make their world a better place. But it was the quiet moments, the ones that didn't make the headlines, that left the most lasting impression. One evening, as the sun began to set and the stars slowly began to twinkle in the sky, David and his mother walked home together. They didn't speak much as they walked along the familiar streets, but the contentment between them was palpable. The weight of their journey, the trials they had faced, and the lessons they had learned were felt in the silence they shared. David, still carrying the quiet confidence of someone who had stood firm in their values, glanced up at his mother. She had always been his rock, teaching him the importance of kindness and integrity. Now, he could see the pride in her eyes, not just because of the attention he had received, but because of how they had both stayed true to what mattered most. "I'm proud of you, David," his mother said softly, breaking the silence. "You didn't just do the right thing. You showed the world that doing the right thing is always worth it, no matter what." David smiled, his heart full. "I'm proud of you too, Mom. You taught me how to be strong, how to stay true to what's important." They continued walking, hand in hand, the streetlights casting a warm glow around them. They had faced challenges, yes, but in the end, they had come through stronger and more connected than ever. Their journey had been one of redemption, but it had also been a journey of love, understanding, and unwavering integrity. The community had changed. Mr. Jacobs had changed. Emily had changed. And David, in his quiet yet profound way, had sparked that change. But most importantly, David and his mother had remained true to their values, choosing kindness, honesty, and courage over everything else. And in that, they had found something far more valuable than any recognition or reward, something that would stay with them forever. As they reached their front door, David's mother wrapped her arm around him, pulling him close for a moment of quiet reflection. "The world needs more people like you, David," she whispered, her voice filled with love and admiration. David smiled, his heart at peace. "We just need to keep doing what's right." And as they stepped inside, the door closing softly behind them, the story of a young boy's courage, a man's redemption, and a community's transformation found its quiet, perfect conclusion. The journey may have ended, but the lessons they had learned of kindness, justice, and the power of doing what is right would echo through their lives forever.